Welcome to Craft Politics, everyone. I'm Joseph Lavoie.
Je suis Andrew Percy.
Ouh, ton français, très bien.
Je parle un peu français. Qui tu connais, je pense.
So we are back in your feed today with a bonus episode. We previewed this in our previous episode, but we are delighted to have on the show today Simon Hart. So Andrew, why don't you give us the quick primer on Simon and why we wanted him on the show?
Yeah, former member of Parliament now, came in 2010 to 2024 for a seat in Southwest Wales, a very beautiful part of the country actually, Carmarthenshire, and served in both the Boris Johnson and the Rishi Sunak administration, but importantly was Chief Whip for Rishi Sunak up until the election, and as Chief Whip, obviously responsible for party discipline, but also the kind of HR function, care of management of the parliamentary party, has released his diaries, which I think I've said before is unusual because it's the Chief Whip, and Chief Whips don't normally, have never released their diaries. And we get into in the interview why, but quite interesting because, as I said, some of it's a bit spicy and salacious. But interestingly, he's done it, and he said this in the interviews he's done with us, but also with the Times and other outlets, to kind of just prove that MPs are not like infallible human beings who are, I mean, I don't think anybody believes MPs are infallible, but, you know, it's almost like they should be infallible. But, you know, just in that workplace, you encounter a whole, you know, spectrum of individuals from, you know, the super intelligent to the frankly bizarre. And that is pretty much the same in most workplaces, just that when that bizarre element does something a bit strange, rather than maybe someone talking about it down the pub locally, it becomes a national news story potentially, and people go, oh, they're all a bit weird. But actually, that workplace I was in for 14 years, yes, it's very strange and it's very unique, but it's also in many ways, with the weird cast of characters, no different to other workplaces like Crestview, where, you know, you're on that weird like end of the spectrum, right? And, you know, then there's like the super articulate, good looking, you know, on this end, like people like me. But if only it were true. But, you know, when I was a school teacher, same thing, right? And so he's done it in that. That's his rationale for releasing it. But also it does have some quite weird, spicy bits in it that are very odd and maybe don't quite fit into every other workplace. But
yeah, so if you are listening to this in the car and the kids are listening, you're good. You're probably safe for the first half of the interview. Second half, you're going to want to put in some headphones because it does get a little bit spicy.
Or you'll have some explaining to do.
Yeah.
You know, question of
a learning moment, a learning opportunity.
Mummy, Daddy, what is a BROTHEL?
But I will say the first part of the interview I found rather interesting because we did save the excerpts until later in the interview. I thought Simon had a really interesting take on life as an MP. And I found it very interesting. And also, you know, I asked him a little bit about the toll it took on his kids, on his family and stuff. So it's just an interesting take today. So a slightly different episode. We're not doing a breakdown of the issues. We're talking about a really interesting book that came out this week. And we hope you'll enjoy it.
Great to be still in London. Still in the same clothes.
Although I did take my jacket.
So you took your jacket off, so someone made an effort. But we're here in London still. Got my really good mate, Simon Hart, the Right Honourable Simon Hart. See, I'm not a Right Honourable, Joseph. I was only ever an honourable member. But some people, like, you know, get high office. So Simon is a Right Honourable.
Simon, did you know he used to be an elected member of Parliament?
Memory fades with the passage of time, but you know.
Well, anyway, we've got the Right Honourable Simon Hart here, who was until the last election a member of Parliament. We both came in 2010, having won our seats off Labour. One of my best mates in there, and Simon has just was also a member of the cabinet, was a senior cabinet member for a minister for both Boris Johnson and for Rishi Sunak, and this the purpose of why he's here today is because of his last period in government when he was the Chief Whip. So if anybody's seen House of Cards, you are Francis Urquhart, or were Francis Urquhart, but was the Conservative Chief Whip during what were some challenging years, despite having a big majority, because of the inner machinations of the British Conservative Party, which had stopped working. Simon has also just written a book which is out this week called Ungovernable, which should give you some hint of how Simon found And this covers the period from the election in 2019 to the election in 2024. So Chief Whip writing a book, quite unusual. Never happened before.
Is this the first time? It's the first time it's ever happened?
Yeah, I've done about Chief Whip. There have been other books written by whips about whipping. So it's not unique in that respect. But this hasn't been.
We're talking about political whipping, though. We're not talking about other types of whipping.
No, well, I mean, that may come into it.
Yes and no.
But context for people who don't know what the Chief Whip is. I'm sure most people listen to this do, but head of the Whip's office, which we had about a dozen whips who are all members of Parliament, responsible for members' well-being, all the HR side of it, but more importantly for maintaining discipline, planning the parliamentary calendar, enforcing votes, all the rest of it. I was a whip's nightmare, as Simon will attest. But Simon this is a diary Simon has published, and Simon's kept a diary since we all came in 2010, and we all knew that he was keeping this diary. His group of mates who we still mates to this day, who all were new MPs, won our seats, most of us off Labour in 2010, and we knew Simon was writing a diary, and there were two things we always thought about that, was Simon will never amount to anything, so nobody will ever publish them. And if they do get published, that's probably where our friendships end. So I haven't seen the diary yet. Simon tells me I'm in it. We'll come to that later. But first of all, just tell us, Chief Whip, why have you, and some people will criticise that, right? Why have you decided to spill the beans, as it were?
I mean, it is. There is a controversial element of it, you're right, because there is this sort of old custom that chief whips or whips don't write diaries. I've tried to walk a tightrope here a bit, which is to just shine a bit of a light on those extraordinary years, from when we went from unassailable to unelectable and through 3 prime ministers in the space of 4 years. And that is a remarkable period of political history. And I just wanted, there are areas of exasperation, joy, terror, every emotion was felt in that time. And it's difficult because I don't want to unnecessarily inconvenience people whose lives are already complicated enough. But on the other hand, if we are to avoid making the mistakes that we made in that 4.5-year period again, and if we're to learn from that period, and if we're to actually work out what we need to do to be a credible party again quickly, then somebody has to talk about this stuff. I've tried to do it as generously as I can, with a bit of mischief, yes, of course. But as I say, there's an awful lot which didn't go in there. There's quite a lot of stuff which has been anonymised.
Is that for the Diaries Part 2? Is that?
Well,
that's not a denial.
It's a diary. I think the point I've sort of been trying to make to a lot of people in the last few days is diaries are not the same as memoirs, and they're not the same as books generally. If they are to be authentic and interesting, they are meant to reflect the frustrations and the anger and the emotion and the disappointment on the day. And I wrote sometimes these diaries. At 11 o'clock at night, I'd probably been in the bar with you for a couple of hours beforehand. And they
discussing policy issues and important matters of the state.
They reflect that. So, yes, do I come across as intemperate, impatient, frustrated? Yes. And sort of because that's what it was. We were in these weird circumstances and we were all struggling to keep our noses above water. And I just thought to make it interesting, that needed to. I was very tempted along the way to rewrite bits because I thought, God, anybody reading this now is going to think, how could anybody believe what I was believing at the time? But to do that would have been to compromise the whole project. And it is what it is.
So you've called it Ungovernable, which kind of gives away the sentiment that came through it. And we'll get to some of the particular entries in a moment. But you called it Ungovernable. In 2019, we came out of that election with the best Tory win since the Thatcher years. And then, as you say yourself, we went from winning to the 2024 election being unwinnable. So you've called it Ungovernable. Why the title? I think we can guess that. But what do you think happened? Because it's hard. I get asked this a lot in Canada, right, where people don't understand how the British Conservative Party's collapsed in the way that. Where did it all go wrong? What actually?
Yeah, I think, and partly deliberately, we called it Ungovernable because I think people will automatically assume I'm referring exclusively to the Conservative Party. Actually, I'm not. I'm talking about the state of British politics. And look, Keir Starmer's just come in July last year with this huge majority, and already are hitting some of the obstacles and the headwinds that we had to contend with. Controversies, contradictions, U-turns, all of these things which the press and the public are all feasting on. And it seems to me that he's been given 15 minutes to resolve all of the things which were election issues. Whether it was NHS funding, MOD spending, everybody thought, partly maybe because in 14 years of opposition, that's a promise that they made. The Labour promise, and I think this was a mistake actually, was to say, whatever your problem is, we can fix it free of charge straight away. And guess what? That hasn't turned out to be the case. But instead of giving people 2 or 3 years to find their feet and to get into the stride of government, he literally was given about 6 weeks, whereupon people are saying, bored of that, you're no good either. You're just as bad as the previous guys. Right, let's look around and see who else is out there. We can give them a try. And so that makes government, to my mind, almost impossible. It makes it so short-termist. And people are being forced into taking decisions which are based on literally popularity and popularity alone, rather than good long-term economic plan, or whatever the old expression used to be. And I don't think at the moment, to me, it seems that whoever is in Downing Street is going to get a very easy ride. And in our case, in those years, 4.5 years we were talking about, if you took Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak could not be 3 more different people. And yet somehow, we were burning through, and don't forget there were 2 before then, as well, Theresa May and David Cameron. We were burning through leaders. And you have to ask yourself why. And your question was, well, where did it all go wrong? Part of me thinks it's just an electoral cycle. After a period of time, it's somebody else's turn. And I think we agonise over manifestos and policies and personalities and, the minutiae of it. In the end, politics is cyclical. And there comes a moment when people think, do you know what, I've had the steak, now I want the chicken, or whatever it might be. It's a different choice off the menu. And we went to a 20-point poll deficit in about the 2nd or 3rd week of Liz Truss's premiership. And it never really changed thereafter. It didn't matter what we did, well or badly, how we did it, what the news of the day was, what was going on in the world. We stuck 20 points behind. Occasionally went up 1 or down 1. But the die was cast a long way out.
Do you think those cycles are much shorter than they used to be? I mean, I almost feel like, to me, it reminds me of Premier League managers who just get sacked after like half a season. They haven't even been given a chance to succeed. It just seems like we now live in an environment where every cycle is just that much shorter. Do you think that could explain it?
And therein lies the problem, I think. I absolutely agree. And I think that it makes it, I watched close up in 2 very different styles, in the way Boris ran things and the way that Rishi ran things. The pressures that came with that role and the way in which they dealt with them. And I saw Rishi's role probably more closely than I saw Boris' the Rishi role, where he was extraordinarily diligent about doing everything in the right way, in the right order, for the right reasons. And yet even that towards the end really wasn't making a big difference. And so I think it's easy and lazy to blame social media, but I think social media does have a part in all of this. Everything is much more instant than it was. And I think it seems to have created a situation where the only reaction that anybody's ever allowed to express is one of outrage.
Right.
You have to be outraged. Doesn't matter what it is. The only response is, this is outrageous. That person needs to be fired, sacked, removed, whatever. There doesn't seem to be anything on the scale between steady state and outrage.
Right.
I mean, I used to occasionally be, mildly disappointed. Well, you can't be, you're not allowed to be mildly disappointed anymore. You've either got to be fine or frothing at the mouth, angry. There's nothing.
We've taken contrast messaging.
Yeah, and you can't. That's impossible to function. I think the other bit of all of this too is that towards the end of Boris Johnson's regime, whether or not we liked the person or whether or not we believed the media coverage, or we accepted the media coverage about Partygate and all of the complications that produced. Undoubtedly, towards the end of his regime, I think the public confidence in us as being a party of integrity was being compromised. And people, we could put up all the defences in the world about, the circumstance and the context and all of that. I think there are many of which are quite plausible, actually. But anyway, the media appetite was not with us on that, and so we were being portrayed as having sort of compromised our integrity. Then, so Boris goes, and then Liz Truss comes in. And the one thing Conservative Party here has had a long-standing reputation for was economic competence. And so within a few weeks of Liz taking over, there is a market meltdown, there is an economic catastrophe. Again, we can argue about whether that was legitimately reported at the time, but the fact was that is how it was reported. And so in a relatively short space of time, the two things that we were known for, a party of integrity and a party of economic competence, had both had big fat question marks attached to them. And I think it was at that moment when quite a lot of people and quite a lot of voters thought, why am I, remind me why I should vote for you again? And that was, I think that was the moment. I don't think much which happened after that.
I think that's true, and it was funny because when all that happened, lots of new MPs, particularly the 2019 intake, you'd see them in the tea room, which is where MPs gather, and they would say things like, oh, my inbox is quite quiet. I'm not getting many emails. And I would say to them, that's a really bad sign, because it means they're not like, we got lots of emails in our first term. We both came in Simon's seat was in Southwest Wales. Mine's Northern England, and we were seats that Labour previously had. So we would get angry emails in that first election, 2010, 2015, which meant people were at least listening to the government. And then after all that, when our credibility collapsed on those two things, people just largely stopped emailing because they were so done with us. It was like, I can't even be bothered to email that Joseph Lavoie to tell him what a shit he is and how he's a corrupt Tory bastard,
right?
And how I'll, or if it was somebody who voted for us, how I'll never vote for him again. They just moved on.
Yeah, what's the point?
We're kind of done with these guys, which is why weirdly, even at the 2024 election, when I was out door knocking, this wasn't really anger. It was just kind of like, no, thank you. We've seen this all over the world, right, where governments just are unable to give the instant gratification because either the system of government isn't set up properly. We had frustrations with the courts getting in the way of things like Rwanda, the legislation to deal with the illegal migrants issue. And governments keep collapsing. So inevitably there's all this system issue of whether the system that we have set up in our Western democracies is governable now, given, as you say, particularly social media, the instant gratification. But clearly as well, you also meant the Conservative Party is ungovernable. And just talk us through that, because look, so I think I'm fair to say I was your number one confidant in Parliament that last term, right? And
you probably were on the receiving end of more of my exasperation than most people were. Yeah.
Simon we'd go for a drink, or he'd ring me, and I'd pop to the office, say hello when he could find time for me in his busy schedule. And but it's just so lots of these things in his diary I remember living in real time as just Simon would just be like, I don't know how we deal with these people, right? And I don't want to get Simon in trouble here, but the party did become completely ungovernable by the end, right?
I think there's a really clear distinction here. There's quite a lot of stuff which is in the diary, which is, it's salacious insofar as it helps illustrate the sort of, the crazy lifestyle we're in. What I've also tried to point out is I don't think that's unique to politics or unique to the Conservatives. I think that, we on the one hand, there's a public expectation for politicians to be normal run-of-the-mill members of the public, and that, my argument comes with normal run-of-the-mill, shades of life, and that you can't be both, normal and abnormal simultaneously. It's a bit more complicated than that. I think the thing which used to get to me, though, wasn't that, because people have difficult stages of their lives everywhere, and they fall over. Yeah, same with everybody. That life can just take a really grim.
I used to say that to constituents quite often when they say about MPs and all this. I said, remember, teachers have gone to jail for stealing money from their schools. Nurses have been struck off. Right? These intricacies of human behaviour affects everything, right? Yeah. MPs are not different in that respect.
All human life is represented in Parliament, and so it should be. And that comes occasionally with the more, wow, you couldn't make it up moments, which the book and unquestionably the media focused on. I think it was the other bit which was more difficult, which was right from day one, there were sort of alternative leadership teams being put together. There were people who were actively attempting to, in a sense, do the government down or certainly make life difficult. And I think you mentioned Rwanda as a policy which obviously controversial, challenging.
So just for Canadians who may not know that, this was our policy of. It's modelled a bit on the Australian policy of this was of processing illegal migrants coming through the Channel, the English Channel, in Rwanda. So that's the context of that. So we had this policy of as a deterrent, really, rather than actually ship a lot of people to Rwanda. But we just became very frustrated with this policy. And
I think the difficulty we had with that is that there were counter proposals being made by our colleagues, which were clearly not going to carry Parliament with them. We were never going to win a vote in a million years. And yet it was causing a very, to the outside world, it was looking unbelievably divisive. It was looking like we couldn't agree on anything. This was a flagship policy. The government's life depended on this policy succeeding. And yet there were people who were happy to threaten to crash the whole thing on the back of this particular policy. And I think for me, that was the most frustrating thing, because people could tell you, we lost the Rwanda vote, the government would fall. I'm not over embellishing that. And yet there were people who were still prepared to risk that, even though their particular version of events and how they thought this thing should pan out was never going to win a majority. In the end, there were 50 or 60 people in the Conservative Party who wanted to do it differently, but there were 550 MPs who didn't. It wasn't even close, and there were the numbers. It was one of these things where I was trying to persuade people that politics is about the art of the possible, and if you are absolutely wedded ideologically to a particular outcome, it's pointless having that belief if you don't have the numbers, and they weren't even close on the numbers. And as a result of that, and I think it was that, I say the tittle-tattle and the salacious stuff is, all very well, it's a bit of part of all of this. But the main thing was the fact that there were people who were briefing against the government, organising alternative leadership offers, destabilising the brand, and contributing to the public view that...
As an outside observer, I always thought that's just how it was done here. It's just...
history will show that in a sense, there is nothing new about this. And so, what difference am I going to make to that? Probably, if we move the dial at all, it'll be by a teeny, tiny amount. But I still think that sitting in sort of gentlemanly silence for the rest of our lives on the back of some ancient custom that whips don't write books isn't actually going to help us solve the problem. And the problem, unless we talk about this, we're going to just keep doing this forevermore.
And I think, Joseph, you're right. To some extent, that is how it works in British politics, right? There is much more freedom on how people vote, and people will... And this is where I kind of did a 180, because by the end I was a slavish loyalist almost, having been, when I came in 2010, I think I was the most rebellious Tory MP in that first term. I think in about 8% of divisions I voted against my own party. But I think where it was different at the end was whenever I did that, I always did it in the context of knowing where the line was. I was never going to bring down the government.
And my point
was always... I would stand up and defend the government's position and say, I understand why the government is trying to do this. I would kind of make the case for them and say, however, my conclusion is that it's wrong because, and we should do something different. And then on occasion, I would vote against the government on that. But I did it from a defensive point of view, whereas by the end, it was, and also it was things I actually believed in. I got the sense with some of our now former colleagues, they didn't really believe it. on some of the stuff they were spouting, it was just because they knew they could cause trouble and because it would help whichever camp they were in. Or it was like, I don't like Rishi Sunak because some of them perceived Rishi, completely falsely, was the guy who brought Boris down. And therefore, you know, the very people who were then demanding slavish loyalty under Boris from anybody who had a different view were now, oh, well, I can do, fuck you all, I can go against Rishi. And it was just very different, right? So we've always had this independent spirit, but this was much more based around camps and personalities and, you know.
And there's another element of this, which is about the cyclical nature of politics, is that early when in your term of office, there is always I feel embarrassed saying this in front of you, Andrew, but there's always the possibility that you might get promoted, or you might get some kind of recognition.
It's been lovely having you on. I hope the book sales go well.
Your whole career is ahead of you. Who knows where it's going to lead? When you're 14 years in and you're looking at your fifth general election, no party's ever won a fifth term in the UK. So whichever way you look at this, the odds were not in our favour in any remote sense. And so a lot of people realised this was the last roll of the dice. And I think they thought by aligning possibly with an alternative leadership offer that they might just get the red box or the black jag or whatever it is for the last, and something on the CV, possibly more importantly. And so I think those factors were playing at people. There was nothing left. There was nothing to lose anymore. There was nothing to lose anymore. And it's, you know, and as we noticed with a lot of, there's nothing as X as an ex-MP. The idea that the day after a general election your phone rings off the hook with generous job offers, that isn't the case anymore.
Thank you, Crestview.
It can be pretty terminal, and it's probably fine for people of my age. Less so if you're a younger man like Andrew.
Mid-30s.
And people who are in the early or mid of a parliamentary career who had ambitions and hopes and aspirations, that's tough. And so I try to look as benevolently as I could at some of the motivations, but it was, as you said, going back to your rituation, it was increasingly difficult to persuade people that 14 and a half years in, taking an extreme line on some of these things was actually going to bring the government down. And we had another problem too, which was there was always because of the emergence of reform, we always, for the first time ever in our time anyway, we had a right of centre alternative to which these people could go in an emergency. So there wasn't just the threat of a rebellion. It was the threat of a rebellion plus, by the way, I'm going to go and join another party. And,
I mean, we had UKIP a bit at the beginning, but I suppose UKIP was seen as a bit of a one-trick pony, right? And whereas Reformers, because they were talking about a whole range of different issues, right? And yeah, it was, but there was this, this split on the right has occurred. Just in this vein of who broke it, right? So we were Boris Johnson. Simon and I were not natural supporters of his, right? And I always remember walking back to your flat, because his flat and my flat were near each other, and when that leadership was going on, we were walking back, and I'd kind of already been convinced, and then we were talking, we'd gone out for dinner, I think, and then I remember you just stopped walking about 50 yards from your flat as we were talking about who to back in the leadership, and you just said, fuck, we're going to vote for Boris Johnson, aren't we? Right? And then you ended up as treasurer of the campaign, and we ended up voting for Boris, and it looked like that made a great that was a great decision in the end, because we then went on and won this majority in 2019 of like 80 odd seats. But this is the point, in having saved the party at that point, did he then break it because when he the failing to go when he probably should have gone after all of that noise had been created, right? Now, some people will argue about that, but 60-odd ministers resigned. Then he replaced them all with these ministers, people who'd been there 5 minutes. Lots of them, one of them stuck their finger up to the press. I mean, these were not not our best characters, right? So you suddenly had like a few dozen people become ministers for 6 weeks, who then all got fired, either by Truss or by Rishi when he took over. Plus you had the Truss ministers who were ministers for 49 days or whatever. So you just had all these people who had held office, who should never have held ministerial office, on the backbenches, who were all desperate to get back into an office. So, did Boris break the party?
I mean, I remember that conversation, and I remember sort of dawning realization that Boris was by far the most likely candidate to keep Jeremy Corbyn out. We were thinking at the time then that it was Jeremy Corbyn was posing the biggest threat, and therefore we had to do whatever we could to avert that, as we would argue as Conservatives, disaster from occurring. And we knew that Boris had this extraordinary ability to sort of sweep up any sort of votes going begging, and we knew that he would, if anybody could sort of do that, he would do that. And I don't think there's at any point denying that he did have a sort of a way, but quite an eccentric way, but he did have a way of engaging that wasn't always apparent in politicians. Anyway. One of the things which I used to hear, particularly when things got rocky for Boris, once he was Prime Minister, was the expression, if you remember, Number 10 used to use, was he got the big calls right. Don't forget, we were into a pandemic quite early on. I mean, that would have tested anybody. And I actually think that, and quite a lot of the book is devoted to it, so Boris's handling of the pandemic, I think history will rate. It probably was much the same, if not better at times, than anybody else it would have been. The fact is, nobody knew how to deal with this thing anywhere in the world. Wow. So this was that. So this thing, the big call's right. I think what dawned on us, what dawned on me, was the fact that when you're Prime Minister, the small calls matter too.
Yes.
You can't just say, I got the big things right, but who cares about small stuff? Small stuff matters. And, Boris is very, very ebullient character as well. His brand is based on this sort of chaotic. He'd turn up. I used to sit next to him occasionally in Prime Minister's questions in the chamber of the House of Commons, and he'd come in, his shirt would be undone, his tie would be off him, the back, his hair everywhere. It was all part of the brand. And he'd sit down and have this bundle of notes, and they were upside down and round about. There'd be bits scribbled here and scribbled there. And you think, Jesus, this is going to be a catastrophe. And then the first question would come in, and he'd stand up, and he'd nail it. Yeah. Absolutely perfect thing. I used to sit there and think, God, actually, I really wish I could do that. I need all my notes in order with a red tab and under the highlighter pen. No such thing existed with Boris. But the trouble is, I think Boris's political instincts were quite good, but he was prone to taking the wrong advice.
Right.
And I've lost count of the number of times, and I say this with affection, really, where the day after something had gone wrong, you bump into Boris somewhere and say, oh, God, I knew I shouldn't have done that. I knew I shouldn't have let them persuade me to do that. And I remember the Dominic Cummings press conference in the garden at Downing Street after he'd been to the north of England, your part of the world, during lockdown. And I just remember
who drove against the rules up to County Durham, Barnard Castle, and then tried to use some excuse about he was testing out his eyesight on one of the trips he did. So it was all. But anyway, I mean, I got hundreds of emails from.
Oh, it was a deluge of anger and frustration
at that point because we were all locked in our homes, and then Boris's advisors. So that's the context. Anyway, sorry.
And then they decided to allow Dominic Cummings to have a press conference in the garden at Downing Street to lance the boil, and it was a disaster. It was a disaster because the first question, which I think came from the BBC's Laura Koonsberg, is "Do you regret?" And everybody said, cross their fingers and close their eyes. I say, all you need to say is yes, on reflection. And of course he said no. Anyway, the whole thing got worse after. But the next day, I remember having a meeting with MPs from Wales with Boris, and he started, I'm so frustrated. I knew it was a mistake. I don't know what persuaded me to let them do that. And I do believe him, actually. I think his instincts were okay, but there were too many people chewing at his ear half the time, and he tended to be a little bit susceptible to that.
But to your point, the small details pile up over time. There's, you often read about how often marriages break up, and it's not the affair or the big issue that causes it. It's because the guy just wouldn't pick up his socks for 25 years, right? And the wife just finally has enough of it. And it's like it's the small details, and what happens behind the scenes, which I think gets us to your book, is like also like people have a sense that there's something broken on the side.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, with Boris, he was classically sort of fitted that description really, and he had and has many interesting qualities, but when things got really difficult, I think sometimes the joke wore a bit thin. And I think Boris was very much somebody driven by personality. And, the nation was in 2 years' worth of pretty grim economic and social experiences with the pandemic. And I think it just, as I say,
I have to do a translation there, Joseph, because Simon is posh British, right? Because, so when he says someone has interesting qualities, right?
Oh, we can't take that literally.
No. It means something quite different. but actually, to this point of the small calls, we'll get to your diary then. So this is, I think, just to me, just when I read this part, I thought this just sums up Boris, right? So the June 7th to the 8th is the diary entry. So it's Harriet Harman has been made the Labour chair of the Privileges Committee. So Boris has gone. He's been investigated by the Privileges Committee for misleading Parliament. So I got to read this out because I quite like this. I spoke to Bojo, who is questioning whether there is any procedural route by which we can kill off the report or at least vote it down. In any normal circumstances, a former PM asking for special treatment would be a big deal, but this being Boris, it doesn't surprise me at all. Worryingly, it doesn't even annoy me that much either. So I remind him as nicely as I can that it was he who set up this process, he who approved its terms of reference, and he who accepted Harriet Harman as its chair. So Boris's response is, but I was in India and I wasn't concentrating, comes the reply. I left it all to the whips. You're finally going, not sure that will wash, even if it were true. And I think that's just so Boris. But the worst thing about that was, his own supporters in Parliament then made your life hell, the very same people who had also voted for the process, right? Which is to this point of ungovernable, right? It's just
and that's a good. I mean, it's a good example of the impossible dilemma that we found ourselves in, and how people, I should say at the beginning of all of this, I don't try to portray myself as a paragon of virtue and all of these things. I think that there were plenty of occasions where I said one thing and voted in a different way, or changed my mind on a certain issue, or took an expedient political route. I'd like to think that, ultimately, like you, I wouldn't have sort of tried to bring down the government in the process. But you're right. I mean, the expression sort of classic Boris comes to mind. And it was, I don't think he's...
Like, you can see him almost like the head. But Simon, it's the whole...
I say in the diary, the friendliest meeting and the warmest exchange I ever had with Boris was in the cabinet room on the night I resigned. And it was a really...
Boris's government.
Yeah, it was a really...
pressure on to bring him...
Yeah, I was the 54th minister to resign in like 24 hours, and I was about the third cabinet minister, I think. But there was literally no animosity on his part at all. And it was, came out with the classic Boris line in that, by the way, which was, this was about a Wednesday, I think. This was all happening. And I was explaining what I was going to do and why. And he said, just give me till Tuesday next week. So I rather innocently said, why, what's happening on Tuesday? I assumed something big was going to happen. He said, I don't know. He said, but something will crop up.
But also in that moment, even though you're like resigning from his government, you are like disarmed by it, right?
Oh, totally.
So I was incredibly frustrated with Boris, and like Boris, I think lied to me on a couple of things, including some policy issues but yet, if he came into this room now, I'd be like, oh, Boris, yeah, just like within 5 minutes. Because you can imagine, like, Andrew, no, I didn't mean that. What I really meant was this. And you're like, oh, I'll believe you then. It's just like that. He has that ability to do that. But
in the end, when we were just going from, don't forget, there was about a 24-hour gap between the final lifting of COVID regulations and the invasion of Ukraine. We were lurching, through no fault of our own, by the way, from one global catastrophe to another. And I think the room for that kind of leadership was getting squeezed all the time, and people were beginning to sort of just think, oh, actually, this is fine in an election campaign, and it's a bit of fun here and there. But
although the call he made on Ukraine was an example of one of those big calls he got right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whilst the rest of Europe was still deciding its response, Boris was out there straight away and arguably dragged. I actually think it's inarguably dragged Europe to a position that it would have taken Europe a lot longer to get to. And people, lots of people who are no Boris fans have given him credit for that. But that was the thing. He just, on some of these big calls, he could just get it right. Yeah. So,
and I think I use the expression instinct. A lot of politics is about, your nose. It's how it feels rather than how it is. And I think that was part of the problem, by the way, we had, particularly with some of the sort of potential rebellions, was that there were some quite ideological people who just believed that their way was the only way and the right way, which is fine. But there wasn't a lot of political instinct in that.
Well, because they didn't understand that lots of other people in the parliamentary party didn't agree with them, and they could never see that. Yeah, they just couldn't see it.
There was, often on some of those things involving, Europe or involving illegal migration, it was a case of 50 people from the Conservative Party with a very, very long-established and firmly held view, and everybody else. Lib Dems, Labour, Plaid Cymru, and that. I lost count of the number of times I had to sit down to people saying, no, it's about numbers. It's about numbers.
First rule of politics is the ability to count. Well, we've done all this pretend, serious bit, which we'll cut, right? Yeah. I want to get to the salacious bits. Yeah, I want to get to the really juicy bits, because I've been asked in Canada about a few times, actually, since your book went out and serialised in the Times. And in one group, somebody posted some of your diary entries and said, do you know this guy? And of course I was like, Simon is my very best friend in the entire world. We speak 5 times a day. It's like, he's like... A new guy just started in our office in Vancouver, said, I've been reading these clips of this book in the UK from a former... I was like, yes, it's Simon, a good mate of mine. So I'm surprised how, other colleagues have written books, nobody's asked me about theirs. So it's got a bit of interest, but... because of some events that you do, there's a lot of serious stuff in here, and I think it's, for all the reasons you've outlined. But I have to read this one, which I do remember happening in real time. Well, not quite. No, actually, to be very clear, I remember this happening in real time after the event. Sorry, the response to it in real time. Yeah, I wasn't the one who was there. So November the 24th. So Simon's words. I should try and. I don't have the same accent. This is how it would sound in a whole accent, right? The phone rings at 2:45 a.m. From a 2019er. So that's somebody who came in 2019, clearly pissed, but just about coherent. Hi, Chief. Hope I haven't woken you. It's 2:45 for fuck's sake. Me. What's up? Him. I'm stuck in a brothel in Bayswater, and I've run out of money. Him, the MP. I met a woman as I left the Carlton Club who offered me a drink. But I now think she's a KGB agent. She wants £500 and has left me in a room with 12 naked women and a CCTV camera. Me, give me a few moments, I'll call you back. So this is 2:45 in the morning. So Simon's words, bloody hell, this is a mess. I ring SPAD, Special Advisor Emma, who was absolutely excellent. We love Emma. Those are one of my additional words you should have put in. She offers to leave her house and go personally to Bayswater on an extraction mission. I suggest not. She sounded rather disappointed. Instead, we devise a plan, send a taxi, extract our man, return him to safety of his hotel. You go back to sleep. 4:10 a.m, phone rings again. Me, are you back safely? Him, yes, but you'll never guess what happened next. Your brackets are the truest thing he said all evening. Me, go on. Well, I slipped out of the room and saw the taxi Emma ordered across the road, so I legged it over and jumped in. However, it turned out it was a different taxi being driven by an Afghan agent called Ahmed. I mean, this guy is having a lot of bad luck, right? A KGB agent, an Afghan agent, me, so him. Well, he demanded £3,000 for I don't know what, it's a something job? I think it's it may be oral sex. Me and him. I legged it back to the hotel and locked the door. I mean,
I actually thought it was fiction. I thought you were writing like a fictional take on the diary.
A famous TV series in the UK called The Thick of It by a guy called Armando Iannucci, who wrote Veep as well, actually. And it was one of the most accurate depictions of British politics of recent years. And I remember hearing a speech made by Armando Iannucci when somebody said, "You're going to write another series." This is quite a few years ago. And he said, no, he said, because he said, satire can't keep up with reality. He said, every time we write something, he said, you guys do, you overtake us. And, you know, there's, you're probably not going to believe what I'm going to say now, but yeah, it's a passage which is meant to be jaw-dropping. It's meant to, you know, it's meant to, you know, attract attention. It's meant to be talked about. I hope, you know, some people might believe when I say it's not all about, you know, comedy value. Actually, some of the gallows humour that I use in the book is more about you couldn't make it up type humour rather than God, isn't this funny? Yeah, you know, and it's a fine distinction which it's hard to stick to. And the reason this passage is anonymous because I don't think the person in question is relevant, but also I think it highlights the fact that what I was saying earlier really, you know, we have an interesting, diverse and different group of people, 650 MPs drawn from members of the public by you know, an ancient sort of system of democracy, and you know, you get all sorts. I actually, in a funny way, my first feeling wasn't one of anger, it was one of, as it is with a lot of the human cases we deal with in the book, it's one of almost sadness, really. Oh, God, you know.
Well, I remember you calling me, or I came to your office, or we had a conversation the day after that. And but it was more in the context of, and actually I think you get this when you read the whole diary, I guess, because you'll see the concept of like, everything else was already difficult enough, right? Just managing the parliamentary party. And it was kind of like that. It's not the salacious, as you say, that ha ha ha, nudge nudge, wink wink, here's a colleague. It was like that. Now I've also got to deal with this. So, you know, it's like for fuck's sake. It's like
every one of these took 4 hours out of a day. Oh, yeah. Because, you know, there were numerous sort of procedures that we had to follow. We had to make sure that everybody involved in some of these situations was safe. If there was necessary to involve the parliamentary authorities, there was a suggestion here of the involvement of the KGB, for goodness sake. You know, so we needed to make sure that what the background to that was there were MPs being put in danger by people who might have had a more sinister agenda, all that sort of stuff. These were quite big deals. And also, you know, the Whip's office is a bunch of MPs. You know, we're not councillors, we're not lawyers, we're not financial advisors, we're not HR. There's lots of things we're not. And yet we required at 2:45 a.m. to take decisions which, you know, might have a, you know, profound impact on people. And that always made me nervous, actually. I always was worried that we were going to drop the ball somewhere along the line. But it was an indication, the reason there's a few examples like that, it's an indication of you literally didn't know what was around the corner. And every day, something, and it might have been legislative or, you know, something like that. There was something every day. We used to literally have Emma prior to special advisor. We used to have a sort of running gag that there was always a segment in my diary which was kept free. And I think we actually wrote in the diary it was the shit happens bit, because we knew shit was going to happen and we needed some space to deal with it when it did. Not if it did, but when it did. And it always did.
I find it perhaps not coincidental that a month later you wrote in your diary, December 2022, a suitably straight-faced and standard ministerial security brief reminds us that on no account should we engage in a chat with any unusually beautiful Chinese woman, or men, I guess, to which Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack added, if you think you're punching above your weight, ask yourself why. Which, to me, we had, when I was a political staffer in Ottawa, I stole one of my mentor's lines about what Ottawa is like and what politics in Ottawa is like. And I used to say, it's Hollywood for ugly people.
Yeah. And yes, Alistair, who's referred to there, is a very dry, it's a very dry sense of humour. He was never afraid to sort of slightly say what everybody was thinking, and he in a sense he was right. And I say, people in every workplace in the land, you and I have sat in a bar from time to time, and at the end of a long day and decompressed a little bit, and if somebody recorded that and played it back 10 years later, you might think, oh god.
Yeah, but I've never wandered down to Clapham Common and had a moment of madness. Oh, not that I told you, because it's not me.
It didn't mention it to me.
So these are on the salacious stuff. I have to read this one as well, because this has got a lot of pickup, right? Which is the one that some people in Canada messaged me about, what the fuck is up with you Brits in politics? So October the 31st, so Halloween, and this is quite Halloweeny. Among today's HR joys is the report that a departmental SPAD, it's a special advisor, that's a political appointment, went to an orgy over the weekend and ended up taking a crap on another person's head. I mean, just how do you,
Well, it fits the category of you couldn't make it up. On the one hand, yes, it's your jaw drops when you read that stuff, but also I think it is helpful that people know that this is not a straight.
Yeah, and it's not, and as you say, none of that is. I mean, it sounds it because it's politics, right? And people, it gets coverage if it happens, right? But people make all sorts of choices in their personal life, in any other walk of life, right? It's just when you're in politics. So, I mean, I think that is and you said this in the Times interview, the important thing about the book is, yes, you can point to the situation, but it's actually just proving really and I used to say this to constituents when I was, in office, you go to events, and I'd have to say to people sometimes, you do know, MPs are not just all created in a room somewhere. We're just ordinary people doing a job, and we all come with the same personal flaws, the same challenges. Sometimes we make bad judgments that anybody else makes in that. And I, when I was a teacher, I worked with people who, got up to some pretty fruity things in their personal life, right? But never came to the fore. No one cared, right? Because they were school teachers, didn't affect their job. And I suppose that is the serious element of this is, most people who go there, I think we can still say, go there for good reason and do the job well, but
I think that is a sort of crucial observation, because it always used to upset me and offend me a bit that when anything went wrong in government, or indeed wrong in Parliament, there was an accompanying sort of narrative out there in the world of the media, perhaps, which was somehow this was all part of a deliberate attempt by MPs to get one over on voters. It was always deemed to be some kind of malevolent motive when a policy didn't work, or a politician did something they shouldn't have done. Actually, 99 times out of 100, the examples that I saw myself were the result of mistakes rather than deliberate mischief.
Cock up, not conspiracy.
Government conspiracies are almost impossible.
It's just that. Well, as Ron Davis said, a moment of madness. It's by writing this, you stand at the risk of being, contributing to the problem rather than contributing to the solution. It's a difficult one, but I just think we have to sort of talk about these things, and because apart from anything else, if we don't, then the gene pool from which we select our MPs will get ever smaller, and therefore these problems will get ever harder.
Simon, obviously we joked about, we focused on, and obviously mainstream media has been very focused on the more salacious entries. That means sometimes maybe the entries that you thought are the most important or deserve a little bit more attention kind of get lost because it's not nearly as salacious or interesting. Is there a specific passage or part of your diary that you hope doesn't get lost in all this?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound possibly a bit trite, but part of the sort of underlying thing that I wanted to get across here was around the fact that there were sort of two groups of people who I want to come out of this well. But of course I want MPs to come out of it well, but people We talk about MPs all the time. MPs are in the public eye all the time, so that'll deal with itself. I think one group of people who always got a massive amount of criticism in our operation were special advisors, and particularly number 10 special advisors. And it was a very easy, lazy thing for people to say. When anything went wrong, so it's bloody spads in number 10, what do they know about?
Yeah, I lazily did that a lot.
Yeah, what do they know about life here? Bunch of kids.
25-year-olds.
And all that. My experience of spads in number 10 was universally excellent. I thought they were an unbelievably interesting, clever, hard-working, committed bunch of people who never, ever got any praise from anybody. The other group of people who used to get a lot of flack, still do, is civil service. And I can only speak to the experience of 3 departments: the Cabinet Office, the Wales Office and the Whip's Office. The civil servants I dealt with were first rate. Patient, discreet, hard-working and committed, and above all impartial. And so I just, because nobody else ever does this, I want to sort of nod in their general direction. And also, risk of sounding a little bit sycophantic, Rishi Sunak was a very decent guy, is a very decent guy, who did his absolute best to do the right thing for the right reasons, and succeeded in many respects. I mean, his ability to, when he was Chancellor over things like the pandemic and the way in which he got the Treasury to move at a speed it had never previously moved in order to safeguard so many jobs, has been rather forgotten. And I also think that he is, if the requirement of the day after Boris and after Liz Truss was a period of relative sort of economic calm and economic confidence, he did provide that. It might not have got rewarded in the ballot box in July 2024, but I think one day people look back and think actually he did a pretty good job in that respect. And so I hope in a way that bits of this will reflect well on him as well as, but as I say, almost more importantly, it's the people who can't and don't have a public platform, civil servants and special advisors. They may think an endorsement from me is the last thing in the world they want, but they're going to get one whether they like it or not.
When I heard Simon say this might sound sycophantic, I thought, Simon's going to say, I got to work and serve alongside some really decent members of Parliament who were motivated by good.
I start one of the chapters with a tribute to Andrew Percy, and an explanation as to why your contribution has perhaps hasn't been fully appreciated. But unfortunately, there isn't an index in the book. We deliberately.
Yeah, I see. That was going to be my final question. Is he keeps telling me and teasing me that I'm in this book on more than one occasion, and I haven't yet been told, apart from that, what the other ones are.
Well, no, and the thing is. So we reckon if we put an index in, people like Andrew go into the bookshop, they look at the back, see which pages they're on, have a quick look, put the book back on the shelf. By not having an index, you're going to have to buy that book.
I've already pre-ordered it.
I do have a final question. So, Simon, I noticed that your son has publicly written about what it was like to be the child of a high-profile MP and the toll it takes on the family, particularly in the social media age. And I recall when he wrote about this a few months back, he talks about the progression from a time when there was you could easily be proud about being the son of an MP to it just became so problematic because of all the vitriol and all the hatred. Listening to you talk today,
he'd rather tell his friends that you were in prison than that you were a Tory MP, right? Sorry.
But you look at that level of toxicity, and then obviously there's one way to interpret some of your diaries, which is it's all falling apart. But I detected, but maybe I'm wrong, a slight hint of optimism in your voice about what you think the role is of politics and political actors. Do you have that sense of optimism? And do you think politics has become so toxic that it's unredeemable?
I'm always optimistic because I think that just around the corner, everybody's going to wake up to the path down which we are going, and everybody's going to simultaneously say, "Oh, stop! Right, we're on the precipice. We're on the precipice. We've got to stop." and we've got to have a big rethink about how we do stuff, and the way in which we encourage and recruit and train and mentor and look after people. And it doesn't matter whether they're MPs; they might want to stand for their local council. It's just going into elected office and all of the the pressures that brings, but as well as the privileges that brings as well. So I'd like to think everybody's sort of got their eyes wide open, their ears wide open, and going to cotton on to the fact that if we just carry on as we are, that's the bit where I'm a bit depressed. That the current trajectory is a worrying one, and made worse by the fact that I think the sort of language which is being used, bear with me on this one, by sort of Trump and Elon Musk, sort of almost legitimizes a sort of an attitude to politicians, which ultimately is self-defeating, because we will run out of politicians. People will not do this job if they think that their children aren't going to be able to admit it in school, or that's going to compromise their family's sort of credibility in their local area. And I remember having a debate in Parliament after the 2015 election about intimidation.
It was 2017.
17, was it? And thinking then, right, this is the moment we're going to change everything. No. Still, it's worse than it's ever been.
Yeah.
Worse than it's ever been. And everybody's been a bit, it's all too difficult. Nobody really wants to confront it because they don't want to look like it's special pleading.
I remember that debate. It was Westminster Hall, 2017. You secured it because I went in and spoke, and I sat next to you. And then, but even then, there were some people who spoke in that debate who were almost justifying some of the abuse we'd got on our side. It was a very straight, or just trying to, it's okay, if there was abuse in one direction, it was unacceptable.
And my big fear is that the way it's going at the moment is all you end up with in Parliament is either ideologues or people with incredibly thick skins. That neither of those things are good, because I think, thick-skinned ideologues don't necessarily have the empathy necessary to understand what a sort of decent social care policy looks like. For example, we want people to be incredibly sensitive to and empathetic to some of the really serious problems facing the nation, facing the world. And at the moment, I think we're making it as difficult as we possibly can for those kind of people to say, yeah, that's the life for me. I've done 25 years in the National Health Service. I want to give something back to my community, but I'm not going to bloody do that because all I'm going to do is get my head kicked in. We have to change that. But I sort of am optimistic that we can, because you have to be, don't you?
Yeah. I sat down last weekend with a Conservative candidate in Canada, in Vancouver, and over lunch I just happened to get onto the whole safety issue. I said, well, I had my staff were spat at, I had to get 2 restraining orders in my time in Parliament. I had a number of death threats, quite a few in the recent years. And I said, and of course, I served with 2. Yeah, from you. Yeah, I said that didn't make it. I said, and I, served with 2 colleagues who were murdered, and he was like, "What the fuck?" And this is somebody who comes from a background, quite a tough guy. I could see him thinking, "What the fuck am I getting myself into?" But you get to the point of like, you'll end up with demagogues, ideologues, or people who are just a bit barking mad, right? For whom this stuff means nothing to them.
It's just all a big game.
Yeah, and it's all big again. It's like,
And my son Adam's piece, which you referred to, Joe. Now, what made me sad when I read that, I didn't know that that's what he was thinking at the time. Oh. It wasn't until that article came out. I knew he was writing the article, but it wasn't until it came out that I knew half the stuff in it. And I thought, that's ridiculous. He didn't even share that with me. Right. We have to correct that. It's not a party political thing, that is it? It's just about public office, and it's no good. I know people often just default to, oh well, that's politics, isn't it? Actually,
no, it isn't.
No, it isn't.
Yeah, I remember actually after that 2017 election, which was particularly nasty, and all sorts of threats and everything. And I remember a Labour MP's wife to me afterwards when I said, she went, well, yeah, people are angry, aren't they? When I was explaining this. And I was like, what the fuck? It doesn't matter how angry you are. You can't go around spitting, threatening, attacking people in the street, attacking their property, threatening their families, just because you're angry about it.
Yes, because it's one thing, Donald Trump saying something on Twitter or X, whatever it is. or it's one thing political leaders in the UK using language like that. The trouble is it translates down to, the strange guy who lives on his own, who nobody really knows, who is actually researching weird stuff on the internet and then, finding out which way you walk home from your office at night, stuff like that. They're the ones who take what Trump might say literally as permission to treat elected members of parliament anywhere in the world differently from the rest of society. And that's where the danger lies.
We've discussed before, which is for democracy to function, you have to believe, the rule that we all have to believe is that everybody who goes into it, apart from, maybe some fringe groups at the very, very extremes of politics, which we would all agree and maybe not going into that reason, but, mainstream political parties, people have gone into it to do a good job and to try to do the best. And we have to accept our political opponents are motivated by the right thing, but they just have the wrong solutions, right, to the same problems we're trying to resolve. The problem now is it's increasingly becoming, if you're on the left, you just shout at people on the right as evil, money-making scumbags who are trying to sell the entire country and everything in it to their rich friends. And then people on the right look at people on the left and they say, that lot hate their country, they're unpatriotic, they want us to be taken over by whatever, and so there's no fundamental bit in the middle where we say, oh, I just disagree with you, I think you're wrong on that, but I understand you're still motivated by good. It's now actually, no, these people have gone into it because they're motivated by ill, by bad.
We've gone from a place where the fringe was called a fringe because it was on the edges, but now most people's default consumption of media, particularly political media or news, is now all in a bunch of fringes, right? There's no more mainstream anymore, or there's less and less of it because it's all been balkanized in terms of where people get their sources. And I think when you're constantly in an echo chamber, you're constantly in that fringe environment, it becomes your new reality. So I think we got a scenario where we've got all these people who hold these violent or very anger-filled views on politicians or about the political process, and it's all fueled by the fact that they're consuming French content.
We can't agree on facts, can we? Because you can't agree on facts. I remember this just with a lady in my constituency in the local elections a couple of years ago, and I had this conversation with her on the doorstep. She was actually out in a garden, lovely lady. She'd always voted for me, but she was thinking of reform and all the rest of it. It was about immigration numbers, illegal migration numbers. She said, oh, well, they all come to Britain. And I said, look, there's a big issue with illegal migration. I'm angry about it as well. But just to be clear, the UK gets far fewer than most European countries, either in real numbers or percentage of, the size of our... She went, no, they all come here. And I said, no, I said, I have to come back to you on this and say that that's just not true. This went backwards and forwards. She went, no, I just don't believe you. And I said, no, what I'm telling you is a fact. She's like, well, we're just going to have to disagree then. And I said to her, I said, and we moved on to something else. And in the end of the conversation, I went back to her again. I said, look, I have to just say to you, we can't disagree on a fact, right? These are the numbers, right? You can't just say you disagree with me on that and that you have a different fact. But I left that, and even though I knew I was absolutely right, doesn't mean that she had every right to criticise us for not dealing with the issue. But this fundamental thing of we get more than anybody else in Europe, she continued to believe, even when I presented to her the fact. And I just thought, if we can't agree on the facts, what hope is there for democracy?
But any glance, the ill-advised though it might be, at a sort of conversation on social media reveals the extraordinary level of that. I see it as sort of conspiracy theories, and I think that it's extraordinary. Sensible people I've known all my life, are so convinced by the fact that the facts aren't the facts that you think, God, those are the moments when I'm quite glad to be here on the outside, because you can't do anything about it.
Well, look, this is descending into two middle-aged men and a younger, articulate, good-looking younger man violently agreeing with one another, which is not what anybody wants to listen to. So we should probably bring it to a close there. But thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Pleasure. No, thank you.
Looking forward to part 2 of the Diaries and the serialisation. But no, that was great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.